Parents, what horrific moment made you realize there was something wrong with your kid? In 2012, I noticed my 7-year-old dog had been acting noticeably different. I guess I could describe it as distant and even depressed. He was normally an extremely outgoing, very playful and energetic dog. But suddenly, he started acting very withdrawn and nervous around people, even his own family. At first, I kind of brushed it off as him feeling under the weather, but after about a week and a half, I decided maybe he needed to see a vet. After an examination, the vet told me that he suspected the dog had been sodomized due to the damage around his butt. He said he couldn't really imagine that his injuries could have come about any other way. So already, I was pretty upset and sort of freaking out. Who would do this kind of thing to a dog? I came home and thought about it for a while. I thought about all the people who had access to the dog in my backyard, but the only people who lived in the house were my wife, myself, and our teenage son. For some reason, I had this really ugly sinking feeling in my stomach about the possibility that it could have been my son. I decided to look around his room. I didn't really know what I was expecting to find, and I didn't really find anything in there that screamed guilty until I checked his browser history. I found he had been on a savage, disgusting animal forum recently and a site with pictures of that sort of thing. I felt like I was going to throw up. Now I knew that this wasn't definitive proof of anything, but the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that my son had been sodomizing our dog. That night, after my wife went to bed, I went into my son's room to have a talk. I basically said, "Listen, I noticed the dog has been acting weird. I took him to the vet and I found out someone had sodomized him. Any ideas what might have happened?" I looked at my son, and while he seemed ever so slightly nervous, he pretended to know nothing about it. So, I brought up the sites I found on his computer. Naturally, this made him pretty upset, and he got really indignant at the thought that I snooped around on his computer. I got him back to the point and tried to be as understanding and fatherly as I could. I told him that whatever happened, I wasn't going to judge him and he wasn't going to be punished. I just needed to know the truth. After about 15 minutes of this, he finally broke down and admitted that he used his fingers and the handle of a hairbrush on the dog the previous week. He said he wasn't trying to hurt him and he stopped when the dog at one point freaked out. He said he didn't think he hurt Colby that bad, and he was too embarrassed to tell us or do anything about it. I believed him in this, but he also didn't give a very satisfactory answer as to why exactly he would do this in the first place. Regardless, I didn't want to blow up the situation, so we initially agreed that I wouldn't tell his mom. My one condition was that we would find a reason to tell her that he needs to see a therapist for a bit. I made him swear that he would not touch the dog like that again under threat of severe consequences. When I located a therapist that specializes in teenagers, I made a preliminary appointment for my son to go in and talk to her. I disclosed to her some of the issues, without getting into too much detail. I didn't tell my son this, but I thought it would be helpful for her to have some idea of what we're dealing with. At the time, my dog was still not in the best of spirits but seemed to be making progress. I took him for more walks and tried to be extra good to him as well. Slowly he became more playful and the love seemed to slowly bring the happiness back into his eyes. That was until, one morning, I caught my son in the backyard holding onto Colby's private area while playing tug of war with him. While the dog seemed to be okay, my son was basically grabbing and massaging the dog's privates as he held him in place under the guise of a tug of war game. Obviously, I stormed outside, grabbed him in anger, and we had a very serious and angry talk. He had promised me never to treat the dog in any remotely inappropriate way after our last incident. I put him in his room for the rest of the day. My wife was still at work, and I did not know what to do. I was at my wit's end. Apparently, therapy had not been working. This time when his mom came home, I told her the real reason why I wanted him in therapy. I explained that he wasn't comfortable with her knowing, so I made him a fatherly promise under the condition he never do anything like that again. Needless to say, she was pretty shocked and upset. Then I told her what I saw that day, and she got even more upset. It went from a few minutes of anger to tears. She told me she felt betrayed, and after calling me some choice names, she grabbed her purse and just left the house. I had no idea where she went, but I didn't try to stop her. I felt like the worst husband and father in the world right then. Afterwards, I went in to speak to my son. He was pretty unhappy that I told his mom about today and the incident before, but after speaking with him briefly, I thought he understood that it was necessary. Eventually, my wife called me to say she was staying at her sister's house that night to clear her head. She had calmed down a bit but said she didn't think she could handle all of this tonight. I said I understood and apologized again profusely for not telling her sooner. When we got off the phone, I said I love you, and she just hung up. After staying at her sister's house for a few days, my wife came home, and we got into several arguments over the next week about our son and what to do. Of course, I was painted as the bad guy for not including her in a major parenting issue. I told her we should find a new home for Colby since he obviously wouldn't be safe with us anymore. My wife did not like this idea, and after several more arguments, I found out that she suspected our son never even abused the dog to begin with. She told me that she had spoken to our son about it, and he denied ever doing anything. So basically, I had my son denying he ever sodomized the dog, and my wife was now pissed off because she was hearing two conflicting stories from us. She even brought up in the heat of our argument that she thought if anything, I sodomized the dog. As you can imagine, I was furious. To make a long story short, we did not resolve anything and had only become more embittered with each other. This, along with a few other marital issues, finally led to my wife asking for a trial separation weeks later. My son decided to live with her, so I moved out to a friend's house while I tried to figure out what we were going to do next. I tried to take Colby with me, but this only led to more friction and infuriating jabs from my wife. As a result, Colby stayed with them. I tried to confront my son about denying what he did, but he wouldn't talk to me and started calling me crazy. I guess he saw a way out of all of this and decided to just throw his dad under the bus. To be honest, that was probably the most hurtful part of this entire ordeal. I was used to having my wife be a complete jerk to me at this point, but the betrayal of my son, who I was only trying to help, was like a knife in my heart. That being said, I had to remind myself that he was just a kid in an awkward situation, and I tried not to hold it against him. After all, if my wife and I ended up with a divorce down the road, he would be the only thing I loved. So I was trying not to do irreparable damage to our relationship. I felt like I had done enough damage to this family. I wished I could say my priority at that time was still on Colby's safety, but I would have been lying. My relationship with my family was in tatters, and I didn't know what to do to fix it. Obviously, I still wanted to see Colby rehomed as well, but I felt like I needed to focus on fixing my relationship with my wife and son so my life could go back to normal. I had tried calling my son for several days in the hope that I could convince him to come clean and help get us on the road to fixing our family. He did not pick up, nor did he ever call me back. So, weeks ago, I decided to show up at the house when I knew they would all be there. I knocked on the door, and my wife would not answer it. I admitted I kind of lost it and started shouting and pounding on it. She eventually came outside, where a yelling match ensued between her and me in the front yard. I finally left after she just put her hands over her ears and started yelling dog abuser over and over again to try to humiliate me in front of the neighborhood. As I walked back to my car, fuming, I looked back at the house. There I saw my son staring at me from the second-story window with a blank look on his face. I stared at him and shook my head in disappointment, but he didn't change his expression. I had to admit that really broke my heart and pissed me off. Fast forward some time later, and I was at work when suddenly my phone rang. It was my wife. I picked it up, and she was sobbing and obviously very upset. She told me that Colby had bitten my son, and he had gone to the hospital to get stitches. She said Colby bit him in the lower abdomen, 2 times. She didn't know what to think. Obviously, I knew exactly what had happened. I could tell she finally knew I was right. Colby would never bite anyone unprovoked and had no history of biting or being aggressive at all. When we got off the phone, I felt this rage building inside of me. I felt like it was finally time for this to end. Colby had stood up for himself against my son, who had betrayed both of us. I couldn't prove it, but I just knew my son was abusing the dog again. It was like Colby finally lashed out in desperation after having nobody there to protect him. I felt sick to my stomach for having abandoned my dog with my kid, who obviously didn't care about me or any of us, as long as he could keep getting away with stuff. I left work and went straight to the family home. This time, my wife answered the door and let me in. I went straight to my son's room, where he was laying down watching TV. He looked at me in surprise, and I told him not to talk. I basically said, "I know what you did, you can deny it and blame me all you want, but you and I both know what happened. I am taking the dog, and if I ever find out you go near an animal like this again, I will report you to the police. I don't care if you are my son. This is disgusting and unfair, and I raised you better." Then I went downstairs and out the back door to get the dog. I put a leash on Colby and walked him back through the house. On my way out, my wife stopped me and told me she was sorry. We talked for about 5 minutes, and we both got a little weepy. She asked me to forgive her, and I told her I did. She then invited me to stay at the house, to which I said no. I wasn't ready for that, and Colby deserved better. I had already let him down too many times. I left her crying in the house and put Colby in the car. We drove back to my friend's place, where I was staying. Colby was finally with me and was safe, and I needed time to think about what our next move should be. I knew that asking my friend to house me and now a dog was pushing the bounds of his good grace, but this was what had to happen. Fast forward to 2018, and my ex and I never got back together. However, things had gotten better in those years. Colby, sadly, passed away a year before. He was getting up there for a dog his size, and it was of natural causes. My son and I didn't talk for years, but were much better than we were in 2012 when the incident took place. It's not something we talk about with one another. I hope and pray he no longer fantasizes or concerns himself with that type of behavior. If he does, I wouldn't know about it since he lives on his own now. As for my ex-wife, she wound up in therapy after losing her job. Honestly, we don't communicate much, but I do not hear good things about what she's up to now. There are rumors of substances and certain favors, etc. I don't really want to get into it for my son's sake. As for me, I've been with a new woman for a few years now, and things are much better.